How much will President Obama be able to convey to his European counterparts, including right now in Germany, about a smooth transition from his administration to President-elect Mr. Trump's? Mr. Begg.
Well, I think we have to recognize that these days Obama has no power left. He's in a transition. The US system, though, is very robust. It facilitates the transition from one president to another. That will happen smoothly. And what we'll wait to see is who Trump is appointing to his critical positions: Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of the Treasury. These are the important positions that will signal very clearly what kind of administration Trump wants to run. It may be that what we're seeing in the last few days, namely rowing back a bit from some of his more extreme promises, a fence on the Mexican border and not a wall, not destroying everything in Obamacare. These are indications that Trump in power may well be very different from Trump the candidate who had to play to the gallery to try to get himself elected.
Mr. Begg,
So
on the other hand,
I think we should be aware that the US...
On the other hand, Mr. Begg, as you may be very much aware, that inside Washington, in the Trump campaign, there has been a lot of divisions as to whether they go with the Republican establishment or whether they go with some of the fundamental members of the rhetorical campaign they run. So now it seems that they have an internal struggle in Washington. Are European counterparts going to be comforted by the apparent phenomena over the past few days?
I think that Europeans will be slightly relieved to see that the extreme appointments that were possible are being watered down by Trump. For example, his chief of staff is a Republican insider, part of the machine. That's not a radical politician that he might have selected. However, these are early days. We don't yet know what Trump will really do once he's in power, and that's what the anxiety at European level will continue to be, that he does things which are extreme, seen through European eyes.
Right. Mr. Cui, how much is this trip made by President Obama about protecting his own legacy in terms of the transatlantic relationship? How much is it? It's about his introductory to his European counterpart about a new president-elect.
Yeah, as we know, I think the main purpose for President Obama for his European trip is firstly to calm down, especially this upset from this his allies in Europe, because as we know, it was another shock for most of the European people.
Well, for a lot of people around the world, I guess.
Yes, exactly, especially after the Brexit. And I think now the problem is how about this lower and lower confidence about the alliance between the transatlantic say. And also, of course, now the question is, because as we know, in another 2 months, there will be new president in the United States. So how much of the effect of this trip by Mr. Obama to Europe, which means that how many people in Europe, they can still believe what's the message from Mr. Obama. I think now more European people, they focus on Washington, on Mr. Trump, not Mr. Obama.
So you don't think Mr. Obama will be able to in any way protect his legacy through this trip at all?
Yes.
What about you, Mr. Begg? Is he able to do a little bit of that, protecting his legacy, transatlantic partnership?
Well, he may be reminding people that the good times were me, and now you have to face the much more difficult times of my successor. In that sense, his legacy will be protected because they'll remember the good guy. But I think we need to listen quite carefully to some of the things he's been saying in Athens. For example, that the world needs to wake up to the fact that globalization is not only about winners. There are people who've lost from globalization. And Obama is right to signal that the success of Trump, the success of Brexit in the UK, the strong standing of Front National in France or Alternative for Deutschland in Germany, these are all symptoms of a widespread disaffection with some of the effects of globalization. So one thing that Obama is very carefully doing is planting the point that other countries have to react to this phenomenon and not just dismiss it as something weird happening in the US.
All right. But let's talk about something specific rather than ideology. We'll put that also a little bit later for discussion. Mr. Begg, international relations, transatlantic partnership. One of it is Obama's alliance with the European counterparts against Russia. As you may know, sanctions against Russia regarding Syria and other things, Ukraine, has already been rolled out by the European countries starting from 2014, coming to an end at the end of January coming year, which is also the time President Trump coming into the office. So is that part of the transatlantic relationship still likely to be maintained or not? Thoughts from the European countries, Mr. Begg?
Well, I don't think NATO, which is the defense treaty that combines European countries with the US and with Turkey, is really under threat. Trump talks about asking the Europeans to pay more towards their defense, which, let's be blunt, they should be doing, because it's unfair to expect the Americans to shoulder all the burden of this. On dealing with Syria, it seems to be pretty clear that the Obama European approach to dealing with Syria has not worked. It hasn't solved the problem. It's led to the war continuing for a very long, much longer than anybody expected, and it's really only the Russians who are leading on it. Trump, in this sense, may well have identified the need to recast that European-American policy towards Syria in a way which resolves the problem rather than prolonging it. So I think if you pick into these individual dossiers, you find that there are things that maybe need to be reset, and Trump's an opportunity to do it.
Mr. Cui, what do you think? So it seems, according to Mr. Begg, if the sanctions does not continue, it might be not necessarily a bad thing.
Yes, as we know, anyway, I think it's related to another issue, and very, very, attracted so many eyes from both sides of Atlantic Sea is how about the future of the relation between United States and Russia, as we know, because once there are some more good, better relations, as Mr. Trump mentioned during the campaign, between United States and Russia, certainly it will undermine the reason why NATO needed to still alive, because as we know, always this NATO is a result of the confrontation between United States and Russia. But of course, I think that besides the NATO issue, another very, very big concern from the European side is how about the economic and trade relations between United States and the European Union.
Right.
As we know, after the win of the Mr. Trump, European Union have to suspend the negotiation of TTIP, as we know, because the NATO is one of the security pillar
Right.
of these transatlantic relations. But how about the TTIP? Maybe another stronger economic and trade investment pillar. But now it looks like everything is unpredictable.
So, Mr. Begg, it seems that, do you agree with what Mr. Cui just said, that the Europeans are not necessarily going to, quote unquote, stand up against Russia alone if the U.S. is going a very different direction? For example, as Mr. Trump, the president-elect, suggested in his campaign, even personal meetings with President Putin and his personal admirations for President Putin. What about the European counterparts? If U.S. changes, European changes.
Well, if Europe comes together, it's a more powerful economic and military entity ultimately than Russia. Let's not forget that Russia is a country of 130 million, 140 million people with a weak economy and obsolete technologies in many areas except the military. If there is an agreement at European level to try to deal with Russia, it's going to be effective. Now the problem is, as you know from many previous programs that you've done, the divisions within Europe on the best approach. To some extent, they've relied on the Americans, and the fact of the Americans being in NATO and giving the armed support to Europeans means that Europe does not need to get its act together. If Trump signals some withdrawal from that, the impetus on Europe would be to say, okay, we're now responsible for our own destiny, we have to do far more than we have in the past, and we have to stop the petty divisions amongst us. That may be sounding very optimistic, but it's the sort of thing that can trigger change in Europe in a positive direction.
Mr. Cui, what do you think? Two directions. One is maybe Europe, just as the United States, is going to make huge changes in terms of attitude toward Russia, no matter what the Russia's actions and reactions are. Secondly, is maybe a more united Europe optimistically speaking, and stand up to Russia as the Europeans believe as important throughout the past few years?
I think now also, especially on this attitude towards Russia from European side, from American side, indeed, originally they do have some divergences or differences. But now the question is, I think that it depends on how this reaction from, firstly, Russian side, and how close, of Mr. Trump's United States and Mr. Putin's Russia.
We'll see how the United States is really reacting. In Washington now, we are also joined by Brandon Andrews, former U.S. Senate staff and also director of Impact, an organization which empowers young professionals politically. But his identity is more Republican rather than Democrat. Republicans, of course, I would like to present this question to you. Congress, all Republican now, and also the president, coming, at least at this moment, he's also Republican related. So what do you make of the future relations with Europe? Will that be similar to what the president-elect addressed during his campaigns, or likely to make a sudden turn as he did with many other policies after becoming president-elect? Mr. Andrews, very briefly.
Yeah, well, Mr. Trump and his transition team are currently being briefed up on everything in the national security front. General Michael Flynn has been put forth as a possible nominee to head the National Security Council for Donald Trump, and so it'll be important to take a look at Michael Flynn's background to see where we go going forward. But I think really all of this goes back to the economy. Look at the date December 9th and the week of December 9th. That is when the budget deal runs out for Congress, and so you'll see Congress setting budget priorities for national security and for other things going forward. And December 9th is also the date when the U.S. Fed, Janet Yellen, could hike interest rates. And if that happens, there may be some significant effects to the U.S. economy, which may drive Donald Trump to change his course in some ways in terms of how he's approaching the U.S. economy, globalization, and the relationship with Europe, which of course will impact NATO and our national security structure.
Well, maybe we have to be a little bit specific here. It sounds a little bit abstract what you have just said. For example, TTIP, which is a very important trade pact between the United States and also European counterpart. Likely what to happen during the campaign? Very harsh words, but now, Mr. Andrews.
Yeah, I think he's gonna move forward with some kind of different deal there. I think the reality is that because of who he was running against Hillary Clinton, who is the wife of Bill Clinton. He blamed a lot of the job loss, a lot of the deflated wages in the United States on some of the trade deals that President Clinton put into place. And so I think Donald Trump has to, because so much of his base was interested in having a more equitable economic recovery. I think he's going to have to do some things that are going to be more protectionist. But again, the reality is, if it doesn't work for the economy, if the economy slows down, if we see macroeconomic indicators go south for the U.S. and globally, then that's going to change what Donald Trump is going to do when he's in office. There's no way that he can continue with protectionist policies if the economy is tanking.
All right, Mr. Begg, let me ask you, what's the best scenario? I mean, the worst scenario we'll all know that will be just happening as the rhetorics of Mr. Trump, but the president-elect during his campaign. What is the best scenario, for example, TTIP, from the European perspective?
Well, I think it's worth making the point that it's not just in the United States or among Trump supporters that enthusiasm for TTIP has been diminishing. There's several countries in Europe which are very uneasy about it, including, and this may surprise you, Germany, where there's not a huge support for TTIP. And with Britain on the cusp of exiting the EU, TTIP is losing one of its stronger supporters. So I think there's likely to be the same sort of sentiment on both sides of the Atlantic about scaling back the ambitions of TTIP and going for a more limited deal, which is going to be less scary for the workers on both sides of the Atlantic.
Right. This has a lot to do not only with American politics, but also the politics in the European continent. Take a look at the challenges in this respect over the next 10 months in Europe. Next month, Italy will hold a referendum on constitutional reform, and on the same day, Austria will decide on a new election. Next year, citizens in France, Germany, and the Netherlands are all heading to the polls as well. Elections after elections. So elections always being manipulated on messages coming from politicians toward the realities, popping up the dissatisfaction in the society toward a extreme policy, at least during the rhetoric in the campaigns that we see in the US. We're also seeing some of the European capitals. Mr. Cui, how much turbulence should we still expect ahead, even if the Trump administration rolling back from their previous rhetoric in Europe?
I think no matter how it is a real policy by Mr. Trump after he get into White House, I think this phenomenon we call the Trump's victory already gave a very big shock to European politics, because as we know that the first political figure Mr. Trump met is Mr. Farage. I mean, this very popular political figure in UK who supported this Brexit. And how about this kind of connectivity or connection relation between some populist parties in European Union, European countries, and also Mr. Trump? So I think it itself already gave lots of reasons why those mainstream parties, mainstream political leaders in European Union, they felt upset, they felt unsafe from this victory of Mr. Trump.
And Mr. Andrews, from the US perspective, if there are more conservative politicians popping up inside the European capitals, does Mr. Trump, the president-elect and future president, will have more consent together with the Republican Party going more conservative side, even about the trade, which is different from the establishment yearly policy of the Republican Party?
Well, I think it's going to be predicated upon Donald Trump's first 100 days or so in office.
That's right.
He said that he wants to go in with his pen and roll back some of the things that President Obama did in terms of executive orders over the last 8 years. If the response from the economy, if the response from the U.S. public generally is positive, then that's going to embolden and empower, I think, other would-be populist leaders in Europe and across the world. And so I think if we have to look at Donald Trump's first 100 days and whether or not those executive orders are going to lead to a bump in the polls for him and lead to, again, the economy being healthy.
I see.
And if so, then yes, we'll definitely see a more conservative movement, and conservative leaders around the world will have kind of a rallying cry and a great example to look to, in addition to Theresa May in the UK.
Right. Mr. Begg, final words from you very briefly. Is this a chicken and egg thing? If U.S. acts, everybody acts, or this is a mutually feeding toward one another, this political momentum?
Well, I think the image of Nigel Farage and Trump meeting in Trump Towers signals that there is a new wave of politicians. If you put their names together, you get Farump. So maybe we should start talking about Farumpism.